I want to tell you that if today's sermon is the biggest letdown and most disappointing thing that you've experienced all week or all month, I will have succeeded. Because that's how I feel when I get to this point in the book of Job. Now, just before Job speaks here, he has a friend named Elihu. Now, if you read the book all the way through, you know that Job has these three friends that argue with him. Basically, everything happens for a reason. Job, it's really your fault. Come on, figure it out, curse God and die, whatever. However, Elihu appears out of nowhere. He's not one of the three friends. He's a young man, and he comes in with a whole lot of expertise that ends up not amounting to a lot. And as I read through Elihu's speech right before this beginning of this speech from God that we hear starting today, I thought of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I even almost named my sermon the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then I thought, no, won't fit on the slide. And this is something that, and this is not I don't like this graph of it because it doesn't show what I really think the Dunning-Kruger effect really shows at the end. But let me kind of explain what it means. When we learn a new skill or a new thing, or we're in our career and we're young and we're learning and we have just gone to school for it and we've studied all this stuff, very shortly after we start whatever it is that we're doing, we become experts in the field. This is true about life too. I think Elihu had a little bit of this going on. This is true about life, where we come in and suddenly we are experts. You find this right now on social media and in the public square in an amazing way. I cannot believe how many of my friends in the past 2 to 3 months have become experts in the field of epidemiology and race relations. They're experts in the field. Some of them never even heard the word epidemiology before about 8 or 12 weeks ago. But now we're experts in the field. We who preach are the worst at this, because we're supposed to stand up here and talk to you as if we know what is going on. And sometimes we know a little less than we would like to let on. That's why I have a lot of Bible commentaries at home. I rely on other experts to help me. But if you look at that graph, if you can bring that graph back up, because I'm going to talk about it just a little bit. So right after you start, you can actually you should be able to just use the back arrow if you have to. Nope, the one before that. There we go. So at the very beginning of your journey to competence in whatever you're doing, you reach what is called the peak of Mount Stupid. In other words, I know everything on paper, but I've never actually done it. So now I sound like I'm really smart and I can make great conversation at parties, when in reality I've probably never faced half of the difficult things I'm ever going to face. And there's a lot of smiles and giggles out there, I can see that. And then when you finally realize how little you know in terms of practical knowledge, you go down here to the valley of despair. A lot of people quit a lot of things at this point. I'm especially thinking of somebody who's learning an instrument. You think you know everything, and then suddenly you realize you can't play the things that you want to play, whatever that instrument is, and you get to that valley of despair, and you think you're never going to make it. But in reality, with practice, as you go on, you will reach, there's something called the slope of enlightenment. You're actually learning not just book knowledge, but now you're learning what it actually looks like in the real world to live, to love, to do whatever it is that you do, and you're actually approaching what they call guru status. And you'll notice at the very end, it gets to something called the plateau of sustainability. But there's a very important detail that we need to remember about that point where we reach sort of this knowledge of what we are doing combined with wisdom. And that is that plateau of sustainability is always lower than the peak of Mount Stupid. In other words, the person in the room that you're talking to that sounds like they know the most about whatever it is probably knows less than the person who's standing by, but very curious to listen to what they have to say, who's actually been doing whatever it is they're talking about for 20 years. I thought of this yesterday because I had occasion in my day job to spend some time with someone who is a very young new architect. Young, but has been through more schooling than most of us ever will be. And I remarked to her, because I've known some architects over the years, I've said I've known a lot of professional people that do very advanced things that require lots of technical training, but architects seem to be the most genuinely curious. I said, when I get in a conversation with someone who's an architect, they want to hear everything I have to say. A few years ago, I was involved in redesigning a sound system at the church I used to work at. A new sound system. We were figuring out what we were going to put in this room, and I had occasion to interact with that architect. That architect knew more, even though I knew a lot about sound, knew more about what I probably needed to do than I did, because this is someone that had 20 or more years experience designing this kind of building. And he hung on my every word. He wanted to know. He was genuinely curious. When you get to that plateau of sustainability, when you get to the point in this Dunning-Kruger effect, where you actually understand what's going on, you don't just have book knowledge, you sound like you know less than the brand new guy, but you don't. You know more. You just have something called humility. You understand. I've heard it said that you should never hire somebody that has never been fired. You ever heard that? You should never hire somebody, you should never ask somebody to do a difficult task who has never failed. We don't learn from our successes like we learn from our failures. I'm getting off track, so let's get back to Job. That was a fun little sidetrack. But now I want to talk about how we communicate. Because it's really important. As we communicate as people with one another, we use our words and we use a lot of other things. God seems to be no different from that, as God shows up to speak to Job after we've waited for 37 chapters to hear from him. So I want to bring up a graph. It's going to have no text. But this graph represents 3 different elements of how we communicate as people with one another. One of those elements, either the 55 or the 38 or the 7, is the words that we use. How many people, you just go ahead and shout out which one of those numbers you think is our words. You said 7. Most people say 38 or 55. Show us. 55% of how we communicate with other people is body language. 38% is voice and tone, and only 7% is words. I'll give you a little bit of an example of what I mean by that. If I stand up here and talk to you the way I am right now, I have your attention. I'm using the tone of my voice. I'm using body language. If I sit here and I don't move and I don't really actually raise my voice, go up and down very much, first thing will happen is you will probably fall asleep, which is okay because it's been a hard week and you could probably use a nap more than a sermon right now. I don't know if this is a new thing. I suspect it might be, and here's why. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the name, but the most famous preacher and one of the most famous theologians in American history is a guy named Jonathan Edwards. Even if you read English literature in school, I don't remember if it's high school or college, we had to read, as one of our English literature assignments, his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. One of the probably the most famous sermon ever preached in America. A lot of people have read it. And it seems like it is a great dramatic portrayal of a very scary gospel message of you are a worm and not a man kind of thing. But I want to tell you that when Jonathan Edwards presented this sermon the first time, he stood totally still and he focused on a point in the back of the room and he spoke in a monotone. I can't do that today, can I? I can't do that in the 21st century. Maybe in the 18th century, that flew. Basically what, 250 years ago? But not today. Because all of that body language and tone is so much of how we communicate. Same thing is true of God, and God is a true performance artist, at least when it comes to Job here. God shows up in a whirlwind. Now, I want you to look at this tornado for a moment, and I want you to consider that then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind is the line. And it's just, what a setup. I mean, that should stop you. Imagine the tornado. There's a picture of a tornado, isn't there? All right, this tornado appears. It's destroying everything in sight, and God is speaking through it. That has my attention. This is how God chooses to show up to answer. I shouldn't say answer. I should say reply to what God has been hearing as these people have been speaking. It's important for God to establish by tone of voice and body language who God is. And then he just goes on and on. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Where were you? I want to say this is the biggest letdown in all of the Bible. God shows up, that's not a letdown. The answer? Maybe. This is the one thing about Job that strikes me every time. It's how much of a letdown. God will go on and on and on through several chapters, basically saying, let me just remind you that this amazing creation around you, that was me. I did all this. I made all this. The wisdom of the ages, that's me. That's right here. That's me, Job. He talks about some of my favorite characters in the Bible, Leviathan and Behemoth. There's a picture of Leviathan, a very famous painting by Gustave Doré, I think it's pronounced. And he paints this idea of a sea serpent. Terrifying sea serpent. It's actually a borrowed image from the mythology of the people of Canaan. It's actually one of their pieces of mythology that God borrows to make his point. Now, in reality, a lot of the meanings of these words, the behemoth and the Leviathan, have changed over the years. And many commentators feel that Leviathan is basically either a sea serpent or really just a whale, or some people actually will figure, okay, that's a hippopotamus. Leviathan's a hippopotamus. And Leviathan's a crocodile. And Behemoth is a hippopotamus. And when they get into it, don't they? A lot of people I'm a big fan of Fiona the hippo at the Cincinnati Zoo that was born this little preemie. She's adorable. She's even adorable now, and she's over 1,000 pounds or something like that. But they're dangerous creatures, and if a crocodile goes after a hippopotamus, the hippopotamus is going to win. I don't know if those were the animals that Job was thinking about when God makes his point. But God's point is very simple. I'm going to tell you about all of the different things I've made so you understand just how insignificant maybe one person can be in the grand scheme of creation. I think he's trying to tell Job, you've been suffering, Job, but you're not necessarily the center of the universe. When we suffer, we think that. I don't know okay, maybe you don't, but I do. When I suffer, everything is about my suffering. That's just the way I am. That's just the way I feel like I've been wired. I'm not proud of it. It's just the way things turned out, I suppose. But we've been built up to this moment through Job's suffering, and God goes on and on and on through this chapter. And if you read God's speeches throughout the chapter, you will learn that God is not talking a lot about humans. He's talking about his creation. He's talking about this creation, the universe, the earth, all of the different amazing wonders, whether it's the behemoth or the leviathan, the crocodile, the hippopotamus, the mountains, the winds, the water, all of this stuff that God has created. God is just hammering it home over and over again, and very little is God actually talking about people. It's like, you're a small part of the equation, Job. Now, the only proper way to respond to this kind of message from God is certainly never going to be, but God, I'm suffering. Now, that's understandable if Job would have said that. I don't even think God would have been upset. But that's not how Job responds. Job responds to God, and I want to tell you that I think maybe the answer to Job's question of why is there suffering is in Job's response, not in God's words. In the middle of God speaking, Job interrupts for just a moment and says, "Then Job answered the Lord, 'Indeed, I am completely unworthy. How could I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth to silence myself. I have spoken once, but I cannot answer. Twice, but I will say no more.'" This is the most unsatisfying answer to a question in the whole Bible. I don't know if you're sitting there right now thinking, I don't really remember you telling me the answer to the question, Peter. You would be absolutely correct. I never did. Neither does God, neither does Job. The answer to the question of suffering seems to be humility. It just seems to be my answer to how do I respond to the bad things that happen in life is very simple. God is God, and I am not. It's kind of the definition of humility. Understanding your place in the universe, and understanding who you are, and understanding who you are not. Real simple. God is God, and I am not. God is going to continue responding to Job. We're going to talk about it next week in the final week. But I want to say what this is a model for, what humility is a model for, because this answer is unsatisfying by itself until we remember what humility means to God. God humbled God's own self to become a human being. God is expecting humility of humans. God models humility better than anyone. And it's the heart of the gospel, is the humility that God models. God became a human male, human baby, grew up in our midst, suffered horribly, died, rose, died and was buried, and then rose so that we would live forever. The heart of the gospel is found right here in the humility that God will show later. But Job understands the meaning of now. Now, I think Job at that point, remember the little Dunning-Kruger effect? I don't think he was an expert on suffering anymore. I think he's way down here in the valley, and then maybe he'll get back up later. I don't know. Right now, he's just basically, all right, I don't understand anything, so I'm just going to admit that. The first step towards, I always like to say, the first step towards admitting you have a problem is ignoring it and hoping it goes away by itself. No, that's not really it. The first step is just saying, okay, yeah, I don't understand. I don't get this. I don't understand. And sometimes I think we want to get past that. Certainly, I wanted to get past that in writing a sermon. I wanted to get past that and give you some nice, neat, tidy answer tied up in a bow like a little present that says, okay, the meaning of suffering and the meaning of patience and the meaning of humility, here it is for you. Just open it up and it's 5 simple words and you just repeat these to yourself and you'll be fine, but it doesn't work that way. We simply respond to what happens to us in our life, and we just simply have to respond to God in humility and know that God is God and we are not. And be thankful that to God, that means let's become one of those humans so they can live eternally, forever in God, with God, in the presence of God. And I hope that today, in the midst of whatever travails that we go through, have gone through, will go through, we remember that. God is present in that suffering because God humbled himself to become human. God doesn't just wave a magic wand and make it go away. Although he does for Job, sort of. That's another lesson for another week, next one. Would you pray with me? God in heaven, thank you that the gospel teaches us how much you love us. That in the midst of a massive and vast creation that is beyond anything we could ever hope to imagine, in the middle of all that, for some reason, these pesky little humans, flawed and broken as we are what you care about so much that you were even willing to suffer, to die with us and for us. Help us to recognize that you do know exactly what we are going through because of your vast wisdom. Help us to rely on that, and help us, Lord, to come to you in a spirit of humility that says, God, you are God, I am not. I will rely on you and you alone. In Jesus' precious and holy name. And everybody agreed and said, amen.